Welcome to A Conversation with Will Moses. This event is part of the annual Heritage Society's annual Celebrating Irving, the City and the Man. We celebrate our town, which was incorporated during the month of April, and we celebrate our town's namesake, Washington Irving, whose birthday happens to be, I wish I had a drum roll here, today, April 3rd. So thanks for joining us, and I'd like to take a moment to welcome our guest, Will Moses, to the show.
Well, thank you, Cathy. Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you and to have the opportunity to talk with you about your esteemed family history and the wonderful artwork that you're carrying on as a part of your family's legacy. So let's get started with a little bit about where you come from. Tell us a little bit about this picture, which is of your home.
It is, actually. That's our place there. And that's the house that Grandma moved to in 1905. And where she spent most of her adulthood. That's where we live today, Sharon and I, and that's where we raised our kids, and we still have a couple at home. But the farm is there and so forth, and then the gallery is there as well, and so we have an easy commute to work, and it's all works.
That's very nice. It's interesting to me that in addition to preserving this family legacy, you've also preserved the family home. Was that a hard decision, or did it just happen naturally?
Well, once I decided to do it, it seemed like the right thing to do. It wasn't something that I grasped onto right away. It was the home was in the family, and when we moved there, it was in pretty sad shape. It never had a lot of updating or modernization over the years, and it needed painting and needed windows, and it needed everything basically. It was just the husk of the house, really.
So that's a big commitment. I mean, the movie The Money Pit flashes into my head the minute you say you're restoring a family farm.
It's a huge undertaking, and whatever you do is wrong. And when you do it, and you're living there as well, you tend to not do things exactly the way they should be because it's expedience. So then you wind up doing it all over again a few years later. So that's been but I think we've got it under control now.
Well, it sounds like it's obviously from the picture, it creates this image in your mind of this lovely place that you want to spend some time, and you do both your art there, and this is a farm. It's working. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it is a farm, and we try to utilize the land and so forth to the best of our ability in our limited time. We offer some of the land out to a local farm for hay and corn and so forth, but then some of it we use for pasture for cows, and we have chickens and pigs, and we make maple syrup, and we do all of that. None of it is I think to the extent of dependency, but it's just a way to use the property and keep the weeds back and keep everything under control. So,
but it does, for someone who has only been on a farm, to go, oh wow, that's so interesting. It sounds really charming, and the picture makes it look really charming. Tell us a little bit about why you portrayed it this way.
Well, that's really how it does look or has looked. One of the barns that is there is no longer there. But years ago, that was pretty much it. It was almost a compilation of how the farm looked when Grandma lived there in, let's say, 1910, 1920, and how it looked looks today.
Yeah. And you use one of the barns, or the barn that's still there, as your gallery and your studio?
Yeah, one of the barns is our gallery and studio, and then the other barn is actually the cow barns. So
you've got to be careful which one you walk into.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm just checking that out there.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about Grandma Moses.
Sure.
If I'm getting my information right, she actually did not begin painting until a little bit later in life.
She painted some in her early days, but it was very limited. And it wasn't until she was about 75 years of age that she truly started to paint paint in earnest, I guess you would say. Before that, she was doing a little bit of needlepoint, or what's called crewel work. Most people don't know what that is. It's a form of needlepoint and so forth. And arthritis bothered her so much that she switched from that and went to painting. And some of her early paintings, you can see that transition. The paintings were very much like the crewel work that she had done. And today when there's exhibits of Grandma Moses, oftentimes they'll send some of the crewel work along with the exhibit, so you can make that comparison for yourself. But that's, she was in her mid-70s, and I don't think she ever thought of it as being anything but a lark at the time. And she had put a couple of her paintings in a local drugstore, and as fate would have it, a man from New York City came along and saw them and said, you know, there's something here. I'm going to see what we can do to make this fly. So.
And it did.
It did. It took off. Yeah.
So she lived past 100, and she continued to paint?
She painted right up until the time of her death, which was almost 102. She started to fade there in the last few years, but she was still painting, and I think there was one painting that she didn't quite finish, but she worked right to the bitter end.
She sounds like she was delightful. Did she live long enough so that you knew her?
I remember her, and she was wonderful in the sense that even though she was quite famous at the time, and she would always have time for the grandchildren. We would go and ride our bikes across the field and see her, and we would go in and have milk and cookies and go in and watch her paint. And, that was what I remember of her, is that she was always very open to the idea of the grandchildren and so forth. She had she originally, when she built her new house, when she moved out of this home, she was about 95 years old, maybe 92, and she built a new one-story home that had a studio incorporated into it for her, and she hated it. She didn't like it at all. And so she wound up painting in a little laundry room off of the kitchen. That's where she liked to paint. And part of the reason was she could hide out there and do her work and not be bothered. People never thought to look for her there. But she'd always let us, the kids, come in and watch her paint and talk to her, and she would explain about what she was doing with her paintings and so forth.
That's not a bad way to learn how to paint from one of America's most masterful artists.
Well, we were more interested in the milk and cookies.
Hey, however you get the milk and cookies, right?
That's right.
I think that's great. I think I found this on your website, that you did actually begin to paint at age 4. Was it under her tutelage, or I think it maybe was your grandfather?
It was my grandfather. Her son, Forrest Moses, also painted, and he too took it up later in life. But it was really under his hand and guidance that I learned to do this. He was very encouraging and almost insistent to some of the grandchildren, in fact, that we come and paint with him. And that was fine. But he's made sure that we had paint and we had a board to paint on, and it was great.
So, and I don't have any idea of what the answer to this is, but if I don't ask this question for my friends in the audience who are artists, I'm going to be in big trouble. Same medium? Did she paint in oil? Did you paint in acrylic? Tell me about what choices you got there.
No, oil paint. She used oil. A lot of people think that she used acrylic, but not true. She used oil paint. and as did my grandfather Forrest. He used oil paint, and I use it as well. And it's just the preference, I think, and it's what I'm comfortable using. So,
I hear different artists say that oil's a difficult medium, or that it takes a long time to dry and that kind of thing, but that can work in your favor. Can you talk about that a little bit?
well, oil can be difficult if you're not used to it, and it can be unforgiving if you're not used to it. Again, I grew up with it, and I, never known anything different than oil paint. So for me, it's easy, or easier than I've tried acrylic paints and so forth, and I find them very frustrating. I've tried watercolors, and I'm not a very good watercolorist. I'll be the first to admit that. And so I always go back to my oil paints and try to get as much mileage out of the oil paint as I can. So,
when people think about your great-grandmother and you and refer to what you do as folk art, that can be a little bit difficult to define. Do you have a working definition, or can you sort of describe to us what folk art is?
well, it's a tough question, and it's a harder answer. Folk art, I think, is traditionally been described as unschooled or untaught, the artist being unschooled or untaught, not taught. But over the years, when I first started doing this, when Grandma was doing it and my grandfather was alive, it was always referred to as primitive art. And then in the 1970s, it became folk art. Somewhere in there, I think the term naive art has been used on again, off again. And then recently there's been the move into what's called outsider art. And all of those are, pretty much in the same basket, I think. But basically it all gets back to the artist not having formal training. But on the other side of it is that you have the folk arts, the arts and the crafts, the basket making, the quilt making, all the traditional skills of living, really, that incorporate art or design. And it could be pottery, it could be almost anything that we look at and say, gee, that really has a special quality to it. It wasn't just a mason jar, so.
It feels like when you describe this beautiful work as unschooled, naive, primitive, that you are also saying, so therefore it must not have any artistic merit. Well, if you look at it, you can see that that's not the case. So I'm glad that they started calling it something else besides all of those other names, which sound a little bit negative. So the work is really wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I think that was, years ago when people talked about it as being primitive art and everything. I think the problem was that people thought of drawings on a cave wall and so forth. And I suppose in the truest sense, that was the original folk artist, was the guy doing that. But, yeah. Yeah,
that'd be one way to look at it, wouldn't it? All righty. So let's talk a little bit about Eagle Bridge, which is where this wonderful home and farm is located.
Yeah, Eagle Bridge is, we're about 50, 60 miles north of Albany, New York. We're on the Vermont border. We're very close to Bennington, Vermont. Almost where Massachusetts and Vermont and New York come together. From where my house, I can see Mount Greylock in Massachusetts, and can see over into the Green Mountains to the east and so forth. Very rural. It's primarily farming community, small towns. A little bit of light industry and so forth around, but less and less of that, and not too far from the Hudson River.
Okay, I was going to ask that. So if I say Hudson River Valley, am I close?
Yeah, technically I think we would be in the Hudson River Valley. It's the way I think of it as being a little bit more to the west of us, but certainly the streams and the rivers and so forth all drain to the Hudson from where we are.
So let's talk about how this picture captures the feel of Eagle Bridge.
Well, this in particular probably would be not so much of Eagle Bridge, but a little bit farther down the river, down the Hudson River Valley, really. That's what I had in mind here when I was doing this,
Okay.
was not too far north of Tarrytown, where Washington Irving lived, in fact. Where the Hudson widens out, and there's a lot of boat traffic and so forth on the rivers, and little lighthouses out in the river and so forth. So.
And there's, of course, the Rosebud Creamery there. We've got a little detail on that shot.
Yeah.
There you are. And it's a real place.
There was a company, Rosebud. They made butter and dairy products for years. Yeah, yeah,
All righty. And I think this is another detail, maybe from that same painting.
yeah. I think so.
What era are we looking at here?
Well, it really could be. I would say probably late 1800s, early 1900s would probably be the era I was thinking of, and yeah.
So one of the other descriptions that I've seen of what folk art does is that it tells a story.
Art, at least the art that I do, I think should tell a story. I think people ask, well, what are you trying to do here? My answer to that usually is, you should be able to take a little kid, a 2-3-year-old kid, hold them up to the painting and be able to make up a story and just follow it along and tell them what is going on in that story. And it's a simple answer, but that's the best answer I've always had for it. It is a narrative in paint.
I'm going to refer back to that. So here's the a similar picture framed, and there's another detail that I thought was really charming. There's somebody hauling away ice there, right?
Sure. Yeah. Well, of course, before refrigerators and freezers, that's what we did. We hauled ice, and
Yeah.
my grandparents did. I didn't do it.
It looks like tough work, but it also looks like it might have been a little bit of fun. And there they are, taking the ice away.
Yeah. Well, I think work had to be fun. I know growing up on the farm, it wasn't about the paycheck, because the paycheck was never that great. But it was about being out with your friends and having a good time working. Some of our work suffered as a result, but we always had a really good time working on the farm. We did a lot of stupid stuff and had fun with that.
Well, and that's the other thing that I think about in the work that we just looked at, is it looks like it was fun. It looks like you are capturing a part of life that is resonant for people. And it's like, this is something that we enjoyed.
Well, that's the way I think of work. Work should be. And it's probably not the way that most people think of it today. And I can remember as a kid, my father had a machine shop, and going in to the machine shop when they would have coffee break. And everybody would be around a big table that they had set up in the shop there, drinking coffee. And coffee break could range anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour and a half. And people would stop by and tell stories and just shoot the breeze and so forth. And there was a sense of camaraderie, a brotherhood almost of being there. And I still like that. That's the way we're in our business. We're not quite to that extreme, but I don't mind if we're having a good conversation, having a 30-minute, 40-minute conversation with the people that work for me. I like the people that work for me, and I want to know what they're thinking and so forth. And there's a lot of joking and teasing and all of that. But to me, that's kind of the quality of life, and that's the quality of the employment situation or the work situation.
I like that. I like the idea of actually being able to enjoy what you do and to not have life be so busy that you can't take time for human interaction.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that's lost from a lot of workplace environments today.
So the Hudson River area does not look a lot like Texas, except in this way.
Oh, yes.
So I had to include this when we were putting the PowerPoint presentation together. I really love the details. Number 7 there. What happened to him?
Well, he looks like he was on the losing end of an elbow or something, I suppose.
Is he missing a tooth there?
He seems to be missing his teeth.
And I love the cat chasing the dog. Now, of course, the dog is also chasing the cat, but yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
Fun.
Well, that's small town. Baseball games and so forth, and football games, and you had the environment wasn't sterile. You didn't have a fence around it, and people were right there. And as a result, so were the cats and the dogs and anything else that wanted to interfere in the game.
So going past this detail again, let's talk about some of your children's books. This one really appealed to me because you're telling a story in this picture, which is, of course,
Raining Cats and Dogs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is the name of the book. It's for sale right out there in the lobby, folks. Was that a commercial?
Yes.
I think it was. And this was one of my favorite images from that book. So will you tell us what Raining Cats and Dogs is about?
Well, it's a book of idioms and play on words. And this one was in the doghouse and how to explain the expression in the doghouse. And one of the things that I think you'll find is talking to young kids today, kids who are 8, 9, 10 years old, these idioms that we take for granted are lost on them. And also with a lot of folks coming to this country and trying to learn the language, teaching English to people from other countries and so forth. How do you explain things like in the doghouse or raining cats and dogs? And so that was the purpose of the book, was to take, I guess, a little bit of a lighthearted view of idioms and how to convey idioms in a pictograph, maybe. I don't know.
Well, this was one of my favorites, and I've got 2 more later in the presentation, but I want to move on to, and I think that I may be right about this. Is this image from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow?
I don't believe so.
It's not? Okay.
No,
well,
I don't think so.
It seemed to set the stage to me, but I was like, maybe not, because I love that moon. But I think that one maybe
That was
is.
The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, yeah.
So,
That's Brom Bones arriving at Katrina Van Tassel's homestead.
so it was your first children's book?
It was.
Okay, so tell me about that story. What made you decide to take on that particular story as your first book?
Well, I wish I could say that there was something really remarkable about the story, but there's not, except that when people heard that I was going to do a children's book, that seemed to be the story everyone thought of for me to do. And I said, well, I'll listen to that.
Okay, well, local author in the area, that kind of a thing. So that does make sense.
Well, that and it lent itself strongly to what I do, and
So I think, we mentioned Katrina Van Tassel, and then there's Ichabod Crane there.
Yeah, they would sing together, and I think Ichabod would give singing lessons to Katrina Van Tassel. It was at least that's what Washington Irving wrote.
I like it, all righty. And this, of course, is the legend of Rip Van Winkle.
Yes, and that's Rip when he's come back from his stay on the mountain after 20 years, and he can't figure out what has happened.
And there's another one, and I guess this is probably the same era. Now, is this young Rip hiding from his wife?
That's young Rip there. Yeah, Rip's wife, if you remember, was a bit of a terror, and maybe justifiably so. Rip was not exactly a productive member of society, and she had to take the rolling pin to him more than once, apparently, to motivate him to work.
And and this is where that where I think real skill comes in. If you look at that rolling pin in her hand, you know she means business.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. She was a bit of a terror. So.
And I mentioned that I liked two other images from the Raining Cats and Dogs book. I know someone who eats this every day.
Sure,
Yeah.
I think we all do. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, sour grape jelly. So this painting is in the gallery outside, so you should take a real close look at it because the wording on it is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. We all know people who were bitter and just resentful. So.
And then this one was too much fun to pass up as well.
Yeah, and that was a great treat to be able to do that because, of course, I grew up with the Three Stooges, and to me, illustrating it, that was, thinking, how do you illustrate a barrel of laughs? And, that was it for me.
Yeah.
My book editor questioned it, but, I got the research on it, and the Three Stooges are still quite popular, and most people seem to know who they are even today.
Well, and what a great way to sort of get a little bit of engagement between a grandmother and her grandchildren. Then who are these guys? And then you get to tell that story. So, there's your storytelling aspect again.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah.
I love it. So this is the final image that I have in the PowerPoint, and then we'll take some questions before we wrap up the show. Tell us what this image is.
Well, this was done expressly for you folks here to commemorate Washington Irving and the city of Irving and so forth, and that is a depiction of the Ichabod Crane being chased by the Headless Horseman, and what I think is probably, everyone would agree, the most famous story that Washington Irving wrote.
Yeah, and the title of it is perfect.
Yeah, was it Giddy Up Gunpowder?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Giddy up. I mean, like really seriously giddy up. All right, so before we wrap, let's get a couple of questions in here.
Okay.
So I don't think that this is going to be like anything really embarrassing or anything like that.
I'll dodge those.
All righty. Oh, this is nice. What's your favorite family story related to folk art?
Well, that's a good question. I think it actually is a story that wasn't a one-time event. I think it was actually just growing up with my grandfather and painting with him. That was really a great treat. He had a little studio near our home, and it was almost more of a hunting camp environment than an art studio. But it was it was a different era and so forth, and people would come by and stop and talk and have coffee, and he would smoke his cigars and have coffee, and as little kids, this was fantastic because most of these people that would stop in to see him, I think we would classify as all being characters, and we've become very homogenized as a society today. Whereas when I was a kid, it seemed like we had these guys around who were characters, and
they're fun to know.
They had great stories. These were guys who'd done a lot, and yet maintained a sense of humor.
Yeah. Oh, and that's always a lovely thing to have. All right, let's see. What form of art expression would you like to try in your 70s and 80s?
Wow. I don't know. I've not thought about that. I've always thought about I might like to try pottery, but I've not had the chance to do that so far. So maybe that's where I'll go.
Yeah. How long does it take to paint a picture? And I love this question because there's so much detail in most of the paintings that, well, all of them. There's so much detail there. What's a typical?
Well, for a traditional painting, it's usually, and bear in mind I work at it just straight through nonstop as a general rule. It'll be anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks for a smaller painting, and then for a larger painting, it may be 6 weeks, 8 weeks to do that.
Wow. So that's detail, and then of course that's drying time because you've got to let that happen too.
Well, I've been at it a while, so I can pretty much work around the wet paint and so forth. So
Okay, so considering the story that I told you about me attempting to paint
Sure.
my own piece of folk art, I think that's bragging. And that's fine because you're in
Okay.
Texas, you can do that. Okay, any favorite East Coast artist from this last century?
I always go back to a fellow that no one knows. His name is George Dury. And if you think of the Courier and Ives prints and calendars and so forth, George Dury was the snowman. He was the man they called the snowman. And he did all of the traditional, what I guess you would classify as the New England farm scenes, the New England, New York farm scenes for Courier and Ives. And I've always admired his paintings. I always thought I'd love to have one. I do think that he was probably be my favorite artist from that era. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing your recollections and all this wonderful information about your artwork. It's a pleasure having you here in Irving, and we are all looking forward to seeing your beautiful work outside in the gallery. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Cathy. Thank you for making it easy.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. All righty.